You were not born to obey. You were not born to serve. You were born to become. And for over 200 years, the West has whispered about freedom without ever daring to ask. Freedom for what? They sold us negative liberty. Freedom from tyranny, from interference, from constraint. But they never gave us the map to positive liberty. Freedom to create, to build, to flourish. They broke the chains and left us standing in the ruins without direction. Eudaimonia is that direction, and Enlightenment Socialism is the architecture that makes it real. When I say eudaimonia, I'm not talking about pleasure. I'm not talking about hedonic satisfaction. I'm talking about flourishing as a mode of existence, the Aristotelian ideal, updated for a scientific age. The alignment of reason, purpose, and moral action within a society designed to cultivate its citizens, not exploit them. Eudaimonia is not a dream. It is a measurable civilizational output. And like any output, it requires structure, energy, and intention. Under Enlightenment Socialism, eudaimonia becomes political praxis. It is not a personal goal. It is the very purpose of society, the justification for infrastructure, education, health, economics, all of it, not as an afterthought, but as the design principle, because freedom without the conditions to actualize it is ornamental. It's a pretty cage. We begin with a simple premise. Liberty must be engineered, not merely declared, not demanded, not granted, engineered. That means building a system that doesn't just tolerate freedom, but functions because of it. A system where your access to self-actualization isn't dependent on market value, birth lottery, or proximity to power. It emerges naturally because the system itself is built to enable it. This is where the false dichotomies dissolve. Eudaimonic civilization does not pit the individual against the collective. It recognizes the individual through the collective, not as sacrifice, not as subjugation, but as synergy. Your flourishing uplifts mine. Your awakening strengthens the whole. It is liberty through mutual amplification. That requires an economy not rooted in extraction, but in abundance. Scarcity is no longer an immutable condition. It's a choice, often a political one and often a violent one. Enlightenment Socialism rejects that violence. It removes the artificial constraints, replaces hoarding with distribution, and automates the means of survival so that no human being is ever forced to trade dignity for bread. From that baseline of guaranteed survival, the real game begins. What will you build? Education in this context becomes sacred. No longer indoctrination or job training, but the cultivation of moral and cognitive autonomy. A eudaimonic education doesn't produce workers. It produces philosophers, people capable of asking better questions, capable of situating themselves in history, capable of self-regulation, not because they fear punishment, but because they've internalized their own ethical compass. In such a world, laws become less necessary, not because we've grown lax, but because we've grown wise. Now let's talk about justice. Eudaimonic justice doesn't focus on punishing failure. It focuses on revealing dysfunction. It sees crime not as individual evil, but as systemic misalignment, a signal. It doesn't ignore harm. It responds to it at the root. Rehabilitation, reintegration, and reparation become the pillars, because vengeance is entropy. Eudaimonia is extropy. It builds where entropy devours. The political becomes spiritual, not in dogma, but in design. Policy becomes an extension of conscience. Governance becomes the expression of our collective soul, not rule over, but responsibility for. This is the mantle, not power, stewardship. And if all this sounds utopian, ask yourself, why does a functioning world sound unrealistic, but permanent war, poverty, and environmental collapse sound natural? That's not reason. That's conditioning. That's the inertia of the endarkenment talking. We are not destined to suffer. We are conditioned to tolerate it. But eudaimonia breaks that spell. Freedom in this frame is not a license to dominate. It is a sacred trust. And its function Its function is eudaimonia. That is how we measure our success as a species, not in profits, not in empires, but in how many lives we're able to flourish because the system made it possible. That is Enlightenment Socialism. That is eudaimonia as political practice. And that is the civilization I intend to build.